By the 13th century BCE, Greece was governed by palace-states whose records were written, taxed, and centrally controlled. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, the Aegean world was dominated by a network of palace-centered states, collectively referred to as Mycenaean Greece. These polities were concentrated across mainland regions such as the Peloponnese, central Greece, and parts of the Aegean islands, with prominent centers at Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes. Each palace functioned as both an administrative hub and a political capital, overseeing agricultural production, craft specialization, trade, and military organization. Archaeological excavations reveal that these centers were fortified with massive cyclopean walls, suggesting a concern for both internal and external security. Tholos tombs, such as the treasury of Atrus at Mycenae, indicate both elite wealth and the capacity for coordinated construction projects that required substantial labor mobilization. Written records from Linear B tablets, primarily preserved at Pylos and Knossos, provide direct evidence of the bureaucratic sophistication of these palaces. These clay tablets document detailed inventories of commodities, including grain, livestock, oil, and textiles, as well as allocations for craft production and labor obligations. The use of a redistributive economy is apparent. Palaces collected resources from surrounding settlements and reallocated them to support officials, artisans, and religious institutions. The role of the wanax, the highest-ranking ruler, was central to these systems, exercising both political authority and oversight of the palace's economic activities. Linear B also records military obligations, showing that the palace coordinated not only production but also defense and expeditionary forces. Trade and diplomatic contact extended Mycenaean influence well beyond the Greek mainland. Archaeologists have identified imported luxury goods, including faience, ivory, and metalwork from Egypt and the Levant, as well as Cypriot copper and tin critical for bronze production. The Eluberan shipwreck, dated to the late 14th century BCE, provides tangible evidence for Mycenaean participation in long-distance exchange networks, carrying commodities such as raw metals, glass, and exotic timber. These connections facilitated the transfer of technology, artistic motifs, and materials, embedding Mycenaean Greece within a larger Eastern Mediterranean economic system. The distribution of imported artifacts across multiple palatial centers further demonstrates that such trade was coordinated rather than incidental. Settlement patterns indicate a hierarchical organization of space. The central palace dominated surrounding towns and villages, which were responsible for supplying labor, food, and goods. Excavations at Pylos, for instance, reveal complex storage facilities and workshops adjacent to the administrative center, supporting organized production and distribution. Similarly, fortifications at Tiryns and Mycenae indicate strategic placement designed to secure resources and protect key transport routes. Archaeological surveys suggest that smaller settlements were tightly integrated into this network, linking hinterlands to urban centers both economically and politically. Religious and ceremonial activity was closely linked to palatial authority. Shrines and cult installations within palace precincts, along with offerings recorded on Linear B tablets, suggest centralized control over ritual practice. The presence of specialized religious personnel, as documented in inventories, indicates institutionalized religious roles that were coordinated with economic administration. These practices reinforced the social hierarchy, legitimizing the authority of the wanax and supporting the centralized redistribution system. Material culture further highlights the sophistication of Mycenaean society. Decorative pottery, frescoes, and finely crafted weapons attest to skilled artisanship, while the presence of imported luxury goods emphasizes elite consumption patterns and international interaction. Evidence from tombs and domestic contexts suggests stratification, with elites possessing goods and privileges not available to the broader population. This disparity underlines the concentration of wealth and political power within palace-centered states. By integrating administrative, military, religious, and economic systems, Mycenaean palaces maintained extensive control over their regions for several centuries. Their capacity to organize labor, manage surplus, and engage in international trade demonstrates a level of complexity comparable to contemporary Near Eastern states. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that these systems were highly interdependent, meaning that the failure of one component, whether economic, political, or environmental, could significantly destabilize the whole. As these tightly organized systems expanded, their reliance on stability made them increasingly vulnerable to disruption. Changes in trade networks, natural disasters, or social unrest could propagate quickly, affecting multiple regions simultaneously. By establishing the full scale of Mycenaean administrative and economic structures, this period provides a baseline against which the dramatic transformations of the subsequent Greek Dark Ages can be understood. The systematic collapse of these palace-states marked the end of an era, leaving a fragmented landscape in which local communities had to adapt without the guidance of centralized authority. Before we continue exploring the complex world of Mycenaean Greece, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon to receive daily Nightfall history videos, and share in the comments which aspect of this period you find most intriguing. The Mycenaean world did not collapse alone. It was part of a fragile international system. During the Late Bronze Age, Mycenaean Greece was deeply embedded in a complex web of political, economic, and cultural connections spanning the eastern Mediterranean. Its primary partners included Hittite Anatolia, New Kingdom Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levantine coast. Evidence of these interactions comes from both archaeological finds and textual sources. The Ulubaran shipwreck, dated to approximately 1300 BCE off the coast of southern Anatolia, provides one of the clearest indications of Mycenaean participation in long-distance trade. Its cargo included large quantities of copper and tin, essential for bronze production, as well as ivory, glass, faience, and luxury items such as ostrich eggs and Canaanite jars. The diversity of goods aboard the ship demonstrates both the volume and the sophistication of maritime exchange in which the Mycenaeans were active participants. In addition to material evidence, written records from the period illuminate the diplomatic dimension of these networks. The Amarna letters, a corpus of cuneiform correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and contemporary rulers, include references to Mycenaean envoys, gift exchanges, and negotiations of political alliances. These texts reveal that the elite class of Mycenaean society engaged in formalized exchanges designed to maintain regional stability. Such communication required literacy, bureaucratic organization, and a network of intermediaries, reflecting the administrative capabilities of Mycenaean palaces. Combined with archaeological finds, these records illustrate that the Greek mainland was not isolated but integrated into a broader system of interregional dependencies. Trade networks supplied essential raw materials to sustain the Mycenaean economy, particularly metals necessary for bronze tools and weapons. Copper sourced from Cyprus and tin from Central Europe or Anatolia arrived through maritime routes under the control or supervision of palatial authorities. Archaeological surveys indicate that disruptions in these supply lines would have immediate consequences for both production and military readiness. Luxury goods, while not critical for survival, functioned as markers of status and instruments of political negotiation within the elite, reinforcing hierarchies both internally and externally. The reliance on imported resources highlights an inherent structural vulnerability. Disturbances anywhere within this interconnected system could propagate rapidly across multiple regions. Evidence of Mycenaean trade extends to cultural and technological influence as well. Pottery fragments bearing Aegean motifs have been found at sites in Anatolia and the Levant, while Mycenaean-style swords, jewelry, and ceremonial objects suggest the movement of both material and stylistic practices. Conversely, Canaanite amphory and Egyptian faience are frequently discovered in Mycenaean contexts, indicating not only material importation but also familiarity with foreign aesthetic traditions. This exchange of material culture reinforces the notion that Mycenaean Greece operated within an internationally recognized framework of status and influence, rather than in isolation. The interdependence of these regional systems also extended to military and political dynamics. Palatial centers were capable of organizing expeditions to secure resources, but they relied on the stability of adjacent states and trade routes. Disruptions in one area, whether through conflict, natural disaster, or internal collapse, could create cascading effects. Archaeologists have observed corresponding layers of destruction and abandonment across multiple eastern Mediterranean sites dating to the early 12th century BCE. This pattern supports the view that the Mycenaean collapse was part of a wider systemic breakdown rather than a series of isolated failures. Moreover, elite correspondence and trade networks demonstrate the limitations of local resilience. While individual communities could maintain subsistence economies, the palatial system depended on continuous access to overseas connections. Linear B tablets indicate detailed accounting for imported goods, reinforcing that palace economies were integrated into broader exchange systems. When these connections failed, the administrative and redistributive mechanisms of Mycenaean states could not adapt quickly, making the entire network vulnerable to sudden contraction. In summary, Mycenaean Greece was not a self-contained civilization. It existed within a tightly interconnected Eastern Mediterranean system that combined trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Archaeological discoveries, including the Ulubran shipwreck and material imports, demonstrate extensive economic integration, while textual sources such as the Amarna letters document formalized diplomatic engagement. The reliance on imported metals and overseas luxury goods created structural dependencies, exposing the palatial centers to vulnerabilities originating beyond their borders. These networks explain why the Mycenaean collapse was not confined to Greece but mirrored broader regional disturbances that reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean landscape. When this international balance fractured, palace societies were among the first to fail, leaving a fragmented landscape in which local communities had to adapt without the centralized control that had defined the Late Bronze Age. Around 1200 BCE, writing disappears from Greece for nearly 4 centuries. By the early 12th century BCE, the Mycenaean palaces that had dominated mainland Greece for several centuries faced abrupt and widespread disruption. Archaeological excavations at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes reveal multiple layers of destruction, often characterized by fire, structural collapse, and abandonment of key administrative buildings. Burn layers at these sites indicate episodes of violent or accidental destruction, while unfinished or abandoned construction projects suggest that centralized planning and labor organization had ceased. The cessation of linear B tablet production coincides with this material evidence, marking the end of systematic record-keeping. Without written documentation, historians are reliant on stratigraphy, ceramics, and architectural remains to reconstruct this period, emphasizing the magnitude of the societal disruption. Stratigraphic analysis shows that destruction was not uniform across all palatial centers. Mycenaean Tiryns display extensive burn layers covering large areas of the citadel, while Pylos exhibits signs of partial destruction, suggesting that the process of collapse was staggered over several decades. The relative timing and intensity of these events indicate regional variation in both the causes and consequences of the upheaval. In some cases, evidence points to external attacks, whereas other sites may have succumbed to internal unrest or economic failure. Archaeologists have noted that smaller peripheral settlements often show abandonment prior to the final destruction of major palaces, implying that demographic and economic pressures were already in motion before the final collapse. The disappearance of administrative infrastructure had immediate consequences for governance and economic organization. Palaces had coordinated agricultural collection, craft production, and redistribution of resources across their territories. Linear B tablets detail allocations of grain, livestock, textiles, and bronze, all of which were managed centrally under the authority of the Wanex. With the palaces destroyed, these redistributive systems disintegrated, leaving local communities responsible for their own subsistence and administration. In many cases, craft specialization declined sharply, and the production of luxury items decreased, reflecting both material scarcity and the loss of centralized demand. The archaeological record also indicates that population displacement accompanied the destruction of palatial centers. Large-scale tombs, such as tholos structures, were no longer maintained or used for new burials, while smaller cemeteries appear to cluster near more defensible or resource-rich locations. Settlement patterns suggest that populations migrated toward smaller, dispersed communities in response to the loss of palace security and administrative oversight. These demographic shifts highlight the cascading effects of collapse, As the central authority vanished, both material culture and social organization fragmented. Evidence from imported goods corroborates the breakdown of broader networks. Objects originating from Cyprus, Egypt, and the Levant, which had been routinely traded through palace-controlled channels, abruptly disappear from mainland contexts around this period. The interruption of these long-distance connections further weakened the economic foundations of the Mycenaean world. Without the palatial systems to manage trade, coordinate storage, and oversee production, communities became increasingly self-reliant, relying on subsistence agriculture and localized craft production. The loss of record-keeping, combined with physical destruction, significantly reduced historical visibility. Linear B tablets had not only documented economic transactions, but also provided insights into social hierarchy, labor organization, and religious practices. Their abrupt cessation creates a chronological gap, leaving the subsequent centuries poorly documented in textual terms. Archaeologists and historians are therefore compelled to reconstruct this era from material remains, settlement patterns, and comparative studies with regions that retained more continuous occupation. This reliance on indirect evidence has shaped the modern conception of the Greek Dark Ages as a period of relative scarcity and uncertainty, even though localized continuity persisted in certain areas. By examining these layers of destruction and abandonment, it becomes clear that the collapse of Mycenaean palaces was both systemic and regionally varied. While some centers may have experienced violent disruption, others declined gradually under economic and administrative pressures. The combined loss of material infrastructure, administrative capacity, and writing marks this period as the defining threshold between the Late Bronze Age and the Greek Dark Ages. With palace authority gone, Greek society fragmented into smaller, localized communities, setting the stage for demographic contraction, regional isolation, and the adaptive strategies of the early Dark Age. The landscape itself records a sudden thinning of human presence. Archaeological surveys of mainland Greece reveal a marked decline in settlement density during the early 12th century BCE. Once densely populated regions, particularly in the Peloponnese, central Greece, and southern Thessaly, exhibit substantial site abandonment. Excavations at sites such as Nicoria, Tiryns, and the periphery of Pylos indicate that urban centers contracted sharply, while smaller satellite villages were entirely deserted. Stratigraphic evidence shows that previously occupied terraces and fortified settlements were left untended, with domestic structures collapsing and agricultural terraces falling into disuse. This widespread depopulation is corroborated by a decrease in the quantity and variety of artifacts recovered from these contexts, suggesting a decline in material production and consumption. Burial practices during this period provide further insight into demographic changes. Tholos tombs, which had previously signaled elite status and centralized ceremonial activity, were no longer constructed or maintained. Instead, communities utilized small, simple inhumations, often in unmarked or minimally demarcated graves. Grave goods, once elaborate and indicative of social hierarchy, became rare, limited to practical items such as tools or utilitarian pottery. This simplification reflects both resource scarcity and the loss of centralized palatial authority that had previously coordinated ceremonial life. Across multiple regions, the transition from monumental burial architecture to modest cemeteries mirrors the reduction of population and the erosion of social complexity. The collapse of long-distance trade contributed significantly to the population decline. Archaeologists note the near disappearance of imported luxury goods from Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt in mainland contexts after 1200 BCE. The Ulubran shipwreck and other evidence of maritime exchange demonstrate the importance of these connections for securing essential metals and exotic commodities. Without palatial control over redistribution networks, local communities face difficulties maintaining craft specialization, particularly in metallurgy and fine pottery production. This economic contraction limited both the means and the incentives for population growth, reinforcing patterns of depopulation and settlement abandonment. Material scarcity is evident in domestic assemblages from this period. Pottery assemblages demonstrate reduced variety and complexity, reflecting both diminished craft production and a focus on practical functionality. Tools, weapons, and domestic implements show signs of repair and reuse, indicative of constrained resources. Settlement surveys reveal that abandoned sites often retain remnants of collapsed walls or unused storage facilities, confirming that depopulation occurred rapidly and, in many cases, permanently. Regions previously reliant on palace-administered resource distribution were particularly affected, illustrating the interdependence of administrative systems and demographic stability. Environmental factors may have contributed to these patterns. While precise causes remain debated, evidence from paleoecological studies suggests shifts in climate, soil degradation, or drought could have exacerbated agricultural stress. Such stress would compound the effects of disrupted trade and centralized governance, making subsistence more precarious for rural populations. Although not all sites show signs of environmental catastrophe, the combination of economic and ecological pressures likely reinforced population contraction across multiple regions. Despite these declines, some areas retained limited continuity. Small inland settlements persisted, often located near defensible terrain or reliable water sources. These communities demonstrate adaptive strategies, maintaining subsistence agriculture and limited craft production. Archaeological evidence of hearths, storage pits, and reused building materials indicates that populations reorganized at a smaller scale, adapting to the loss of palatial support. This continuity suggests that the Greek Dark Ages were characterized not by total depopulation, but by a dramatic redistribution and reduction of human presence across the landscape. The demographic contraction of this period had significant long-term consequences. With fewer people, regional identities began to solidify around surviving communities. The reduction in population density also limited competition for resources, creating conditions conducive to the later emergence of protopolis settlements in the 10th and 9th centuries BCE. In addition, the simplification of material culture and the disappearance of elite burials reflect a temporary leveling of social hierarchy, which influenced subsequent patterns of political and economic organization in post-Mycenaean Greece. By integrating settlement surveys, burial data, and artifact distributions, archaeologists can reconstruct the scale and nature of population decline during the early Dark Ages. These patterns illustrate the profound consequences of palace collapse on human communities, linking administrative, economic, and demographic processes. The evidence underscores that the disappearance of centralized authority led not to cultural void, but to a transformed landscape in which localized, self-reliant communities became the primary units of survival. Yet collapse did not mean disappearance. It marked transformation, setting the stage for new social structures, regional identities, and adaptive strategies that would define the early Dark Age world. When the palaces fell, survival replaced administration as the central concern. Following the widespread collapse of Mycenaean palatial centers, Greek society entered a period of significant contraction and reorganization. Archaeological surveys indicate that while many sites were abandoned, several communities persisted, albeit at a greatly reduced scale. Evidence from settlements such as Nicoria in Messenia and Lefkandi on Euboea demonstrates that human occupation continued, but the scale of domestic architecture and urban planning was markedly simpler. Stone foundations for houses were smaller, and multi-roomed palatial complexes were replaced by modest single- or double-room dwellings. This shift reflects a reorientation from centralized, palace-managed administration to local, kin-based management of resources. Burial practices during this period further illustrate the transformation of social organization. Monumental tholos tombs were no longer constructed, and the surviving cemeteries show a predominance of modest inhumations and occasional cremations. Grave goods, once indicators of elite status, are minimal and largely utilitarian, including pottery vessels, simple tools, or personal ornaments. The simplification of funerary practices indicates both material scarcity and the absence of centralized authority to coordinate large-scale ceremonial or commemorative activities. Archaeologists interpret these patterns as evidence that social hierarchies were less pronounced and more localized during this early Dark Age phase. The absence of linear writing, which had previously recorded administrative, economic, and ritual activity, created a documentary silence across mainland Greece. Historians and archaeologists are forced to reconstruct this era almost entirely from material culture, settlement layouts, and artifact assemblages. Linear B tablets had provided precise information on resource allocation, labor obligations, and palace bureaucracy. Their disappearance demonstrates the collapse of centralized record-keeping. Nevertheless, the continuity of human occupation indicates that communities adapted through pragmatic means, relying on oral knowledge, local networks, and subsistence practices rather than formal administrative control. Subsistence agriculture remained the foundation of survival during this period. Archaeobotanical evidence from sites such as Lefkandi shows continued cultivation of cereals, legumes, and olives, supplemented by livestock management of sheep, goats, and cattle. These small-scale agricultural systems supported localized exchange networks, allowing communities to sustain themselves despite the collapse of larger palatial redistributive structures. Artifacts indicate some continuity in craft specialization, including basic pottery and textile production, though these industries were reduced in both scope and sophistication compared to the late Bronze Age. The persistence of these practices demonstrates resilience in the face of systemic disruption. Regional variation is apparent in the archaeological record. Some coastal settlements, likely more vulnerable to maritime raids, were entirely abandoned, whereas inland sites with defensible terrain and access to water sources persisted. Lefkandi, for example, maintained occupation and continued construction of domestic and ceremonial structures, including a large longhouse that may have functioned as a communal or elite residence. In contrast, other sites such as Pylos and Mycenaean show near-total destruction and abandonment. These patterns suggest that local geography, resource availability, and population density influenced community survival during the early Dark Age. Evidence of mobility and small-scale migration also emerges during this period. Artifacts reflecting limited regional trade suggest that some communities maintained contact through overland and coastal routes, transporting essential goods and facilitating cultural continuity. These exchange networks were modest compared to the extensive Late Bronze Age system, but they were sufficient to support the transmission of ideas, tools, and basic commodities. Settlement continuity, combined with localized trade, indicates that the collapse of palace authority did not equate to the disappearance of human society, but instead prompted a restructuring around smaller, self-reliant units. By examining the archaeological record, it becomes clear that the initial phase of the Greek Dark Ages was characterized by both contraction and adaptation. Communities reorganized socially and economically, relying on kin-based structures, subsistence agriculture, and localized exchange networks. Burial practices, domestic architecture, and material culture reflect these changes, marking a transition from complex palace administration to simplified local governance. The absence of writing emphasizes the documentary challenges of this period, while ongoing occupation demonstrates resilience and continuity despite widespread systemic collapse. These smaller communities soon adapted further as mobility increased across the Aegean, establishing patterns of settlement and interaction that would define the early stages of the Dark Age. The map of Greece fractured into isolated pockets of habitation. Archaeological surveys of early Dark Age Greece indicate a pronounced reduction in settlement density across the mainland. Many coastal sites, previously central to Mycenaean administration and trade, were abandoned, likely due to a combination of maritime insecurity and economic disruption. Sites such as coastal Messenia and the Argolid show significant depopulation, with evidence of roofless structures, overgrown streets, and unused harbor installations. In contrast, inland settlements located on defensible terrain, near rivers, or adjacent to arable land persisted. Lefkandi on Euboea and Nicoria in Messenia are among the best documented examples, illustrating how communities prioritize security and resource stability in the absence of centralized palatial oversight. These patterns reflect a broader trend in which geography determined the resilience of human habitation during the early Dark Age. The decline in interregional communication reinforced regional isolation. Previously extensive trade networks and palatial administrative links were replaced by localized systems of exchange. Pottery evidence highlights this change. Styles once widely circulated, such as fine Mycenaean decorated wares, become restricted to narrow regions. In many inland communities, simplified geometric motifs dominate, reflecting both local production and limited exposure to external influences. Archaeologists interpret these patterns as indicative of restricted mobility and reduced interaction, illustrating how geographic and social factors produced culturally distinct pockets within Greece. Settlement patterns also demonstrate adaptive responses to environmental and demographic pressures. Inland locations frequently correspond to defensible elevations or fertile valleys, suggesting that communities selected sites based on both security and sustainability. Excavations reveal that these settlements were often small clusters of houses with shared storage facilities, emphasizing cooperation among kin-based units rather than centralized organization. Evidence of terracing and localized irrigation at sites such as Nicoria indicates that subsistence strategies were carefully managed to optimize available resources. These localized adaptations demonstrate the ability of communities to survive in fragmented, decentralized contexts. The pattern of regionalization extended beyond settlement layouts to material culture and craft production. Pottery, bronze tools, and textile production became regionally distinct, with styles reflecting localized aesthetic and functional preferences. For example, pottery from central Greece exhibits geometric motifs different from those produced in the Peloponnese, indicating that artisans primarily served local communities rather than broader palace-centered networks. This diversification in material culture illustrates how isolation fostered regional identities that would persist and evolve during the subsequent Archaic period. Communication between surviving communities was limited but not entirely absent. Small-scale exchange of essential goods, such as salt, metal scraps, and pottery, continued along inland and coastal routes. Archaeological evidence of minor trade networks suggests that while large-scale interregional interaction collapsed, localized connectivity allowed communities to supplement subsistence production. These limited networks also facilitated the transmission of technological knowledge and craft techniques, ensuring continuity of practical skills despite the breakdown of palace-sponsored economies. The combined effects of depopulation, geographic isolation, and regionalized production reshaped the cultural landscape of Greece. Fragmented settlement patterns produced autonomous, kin-based communities with minimal centralized oversight. Material culture demonstrates that these communities developed unique identities, which were reinforced over generations through localized traditions in pottery, burial, and ritual practice. Archaeologists rely on these patterns to reconstruct both movement and isolation during the early Dark Age, using site density, artifact distribution, and regional stylistic variation as key indicators of social and demographic transformation. By the end of this period, the landscape of Greece consisted of a mosaic of smaller, self-reliant settlements. Coastal depopulation, inland consolidation, and material diversification created a fragmented social structure that contrasted sharply with the centralized palace-states of the preceding Late Bronze Age. The early Dark Age is thus characterized not by complete abandonment, but by strategic adaptation and regional differentiation, laying the foundation for later developments in political organization, trade, and cultural identity. Isolation, however, did not halt population movement entirely, and emerging networks of migration and resettlement would gradually reshape the Aegean landscape in the century that followed. Centuries later, Greeks explained their past through migration myths. Greek literary sources written centuries after the early Dark Age frequently describe the movement of peoples known as the Dorians into the Peloponnese and other parts of Greece. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, and Thucydides, among others, recount that Dorian groups displaced earlier populations, leading to widespread disruption and settlement reorganization. These accounts, however, are not contemporary records. They were composed long after the events they describe and must be understood as part of a broader effort to interpret a complex and poorly documented past. Historians recognize that these texts reflect retrospective explanations for social and political change, rather than precise evidence of migration. In Herodotus' narrative, the Dorians are portrayed as moving southward from northern Greece, gradually occupying territories in the Peloponnese, including Laconia, Messenia, and Argolis. Thucydides adds context for these movements by noting shifts in population, local power dynamics, and the disappearance of older settlements. Both authors suggest that the Dorian presence coincided with a period of disruption, economic contraction, and cultural transformation. These accounts have historically framed the so-called Dorian invasion as a principal factor in the decline of Mycenaean society, though modern scholarship treats them as mythologized explanations rather than verifiable history. Later authors often conflated multiple waves of population movement and social change into a single narrative. The Homeric epics, composed in the 8th century BCE, also reference northern Greek groups in relation to Peloponnesian settlements. These texts emphasize genealogical claims and heroic traditions rather than the systematic documentation of migrations. Such narratives frequently assign moral or political significance to movements of peoples, portraying the Dorians as agents of historical destiny rather than actors whose presence can be precisely dated or traced archaeologically. Consequently, while these literary sources provide insight into Greek memory and cultural identity, they offer limited utility for reconstructing demographic events in the early Dark Age. Archaeological evidence suggests a more nuanced scenario than the literary accounts imply. Site surveys and ceramic analysis indicate that settlement reorganization in the Peloponnese and central Greece was gradual rather than the product of a single, sudden population displacement. Geometric pottery styles emerge in multiple regions over the 11th century BCE, reflecting local adaptation and cultural continuity as much as external influence. Differences in material culture between regions suggest that populations were not entirely replaced but often merged, interacted, and adopted new practices over successive generations. In this sense, the literary Dorian invasion may reflect a memory of these incremental changes rather than a literal military conquest or mass migration. Ancient writers also provide evidence of the social and political rationales that later Greeks used to interpret early Dark Age developments. The attribution of settlement abandonment or community displacement to the Dorians allowed later authors to explain persistent differences in dialect, law, and ritual practice. These retrospective frameworks were often embedded in genealogical and heroic narratives, linking contemporary social structures to imagined historical origins. While useful for understanding cultural memory, they must be critically assessed when attempting to reconstruct the demographic and material realities of the early 12th and 11th centuries BCE. Moreover, the focus on Dorian migration obscures the complexity of early Dark Age population dynamics. Archaeological survey indicates localized mobility, small-scale migration, and interregional exchange occurred across the Aegean without necessarily involving a single, cohesive group. Coastal depopulation, inland consolidation, and shifts in settlement hierarchy reflect a variety of pressures, including resource scarcity, social reorganization, and environmental factors. The Dorian narratives, written centuries later, simplify these multifaceted processes into a linear story of conquest and displacement, overlooking the interplay of continuity and adaptation that characterizes the archaeological record. In summary, Greek literary traditions describing Dorian migration provide insight into how later generations understood their history, but they must be approached critically. Herodotus, Thucydides, and the Homeric epics offer retrospective interpretations rather than contemporaneous documentation. Archaeological evidence indicates that settlement change, cultural adaptation, and localized mobility better explain the transformation of the early Dark Age landscape. Recognizing the distinction between mythic memory and material evidence allows historians to separate narrative explanation from observable societal patterns, clarifying the complexities of this formative period in Greek history. Material evidence tells a more complex story, revealing that mobility, adaptation, and regional variation shaped early Dark Age Greece far beyond the simple framework of later migration myths. Migration left traces not in texts, but in tools and graves. Archaeological research provides the clearest evidence of population movement in early Dark Age Greece, where textual sources are absent or retrospective. Survey data and excavation results indicate that change occurred gradually rather than through sudden mass invasions. Settlement continuity is evident in many regions, with communities maintaining occupation of former Mycenaean sites while adapting domestic structures and defensive arrangements to smaller-scale, kin-based living. Lefkandi on Euboea, Nicoria in Messenia, and smaller inland hilltop settlements exhibit continuity in spatial organization, suggesting that local populations persisted, even as social hierarchies and economic systems were significantly reconfigured. Material culture provides direct indicators of mobility. Pottery styles, previously uniform under Mycenaean influence, began to diverge regionally during the early 11th century BCE. Geometric motifs, shapes, and manufacturing techniques vary between central Greece, the Peloponnese, and the Aegean islands. These patterns indicate limited movement of people and ideas, as opposed to wholesale population replacement. Localized innovations coexist with imported forms in some sites, suggesting interaction between migrating groups and resident populations. Archaeologists interpret this gradual cultural transformation as evidence of incremental migration rather than a sudden invasion, with communities adapting external influences to local conditions. Burial practices further illuminate population movement. Funerary evidence from inland and coastal sites shows variation in interment methods, including simple inhumation, cremation, and modest grave goods. Some regions exhibit continuity from late Bronze Age traditions, while others display novel practices associated with northern Aegean or central Greek groups. Weapon types, such as the gradual appearance of iron swords and daggers, are unevenly distributed across regions, suggesting that technological change spread along social and familial networks rather than through mass military conquest. These findings reinforce the interpretation that mobility occurred at a small scale, through family groups or communities relocating gradually across the landscape. Settlement evidence complements this material record. Many early Dark Age sites were located on defensible elevations, reflecting strategic adaptation rather than immediate occupation by external forces. Hilltop settlements, small terraced villages, and riverine sites demonstrate careful selection based on resource access and security considerations. Archaeological stratigraphy shows limited rebuilding of destroyed structures, indicating that local inhabitants reorganized their communities incrementally. The pace and scale of construction suggest that migration was a long-term process intertwined with survival, subsistence, and social reorganization, rather than a rapid displacement of prior populations. Ironworking patterns also reveal regional variation in population movement and adaptation. The introduction of iron tools and weapons occurs unevenly across mainland Greece. Some regions, such as southern Peloponnese, display early adoption, while others maintain bronze tools alongside emerging iron objects. This unevenness suggests that technological innovation spread through selective channels, often following routes of migration or local interaction, rather than being imposed uniformly by a conquering group. Iron artifacts found in burial contexts further indicate that emerging social distinctions and martial practices were localized and adaptive, reflecting a mixture of continuity and external influence. Trade networks, though severely reduced compared to the late Bronze Age, also reveal subtle evidence of mobility. Limited exchange of pottery, metal objects, and utilitarian goods occurred between settlements, suggesting interaction between resident and newly arriving populations. Coastal and inland routes facilitated movement without the need for centralized administration. Archaeologists note that these exchanges were small-scale and primarily local, yet they were sufficient to transmit ideas, craft techniques, and technological knowledge, supporting gradual integration of migrating and indigenous communities. Taken together, the archaeological evidence challenges the traditional Dorian invasion model. Regional continuity, incremental settlement adaptation, and uneven introduction of new technologies indicate that early Dark Age population movements were complex and multifaceted. Rather than a single, rapid conquest, the period reflects multiple, overlapping processes of migration, assimilation, and social restructuring. Mobility reshaped the landscape through the slow reorganization of communities, the redistribution of population density, and the adaptation of material culture to new social and environmental conditions. By analyzing pottery, burial, weapons, and settlement patterns, archaeologists reconstruct the subtle ways in which human mobility transformed early Dark Age Greece. These patterns reveal that movement occurred gradually, across generations, producing regional variation in technology, social organization, and material culture. Where written records are absent, These physical traces provide the primary insight into demographic shifts and cultural adaptation. These movements reshaped language and identity, establishing the regional distinctions and dialects that would define Greek communities in the centuries to come. Power no longer flowed from palaces, but from households. With the absence of centralized palatial administration during the early Greek Dark Age, authority and social leadership became localized, concentrated within individual households and family groups. Archaeological evidence indicates that certain families, often those controlling productive land or strategically located settlements, emerged as dominant within their communities. Unlike the Mycenaean palace, which exercised authority over broad territories and maintained extensive bureaucratic oversight, household-based leadership was personal, negotiated, and dependent on kinship networks, agricultural resources, and military capacity. In many cases, these elites coordinated labor for both subsistence and defense, establishing authority through direct management of land and people rather than institutionalized bureaucracy. Excavations at sites such as Lefkandi on Euboea provide tangible evidence of this transition. Large longhouses, sometimes interpreted as the residences of prominent households, stand out from smaller domestic units in size, construction quality, and associated artifacts. These structures often include storage facilities, workshops, and occasional ceremonial spaces, suggesting that households not only managed economic production but also assumed roles in ritual and social regulation. The presence of valuable imported items or locally produced luxury objects within these residences signals both wealth accumulation and social distinction. Such material markers were critical for establishing and reinforcing household authority in the absence of palace-sanctioned hierarchy. Military reputation also contributed to household-based power. Archaeological contexts reveal clusters of weapons in elite dwellings or graves, including swords, daggers, and defensive equipment. These assemblages indicate that certain households controlled armed retainers or could mobilize kin-based militias when necessary. Unlike the palace armies of the Mycenaean period, which were coordinated centrally and often maintained through bureaucratic administration, these small-scale forces reflected personal prestige, reputation, and local security needs. Elite households relied on both kinship loyalty and martial capability to consolidate influence within a given settlement. Land ownership was another critical dimension of early elite authority. Fertile valleys, access to water, and defensible terrain provided both sustenance and strategic advantage. Households controlling these resources could exercise influence over neighboring families, regulate production, and mediate disputes. Evidence of terracing, storage facilities, and specialized agricultural implements in elite households suggests that economic management was central to social authority. Control over the local surplus allowed certain households to extend their influence, supporting both dependence and ceremonial obligations, thereby reinforcing social hierarchy at a micro-regional level. Kinship structures also reinforced household leadership. Genealogical connections, marriage alliances, and inheritance patterns maintained continuity of influence over successive generations. Archaeological indicators, including the clustering of related burials near prominent households, suggest that lineage played a role in establishing and legitimizing authority. Households with strong kin networks were better positioned to mobilize labor, defend territory, and maintain social cohesion, effectively replacing palace-centered governance with a decentralized, household-based model. Material culture served as both a tool and a symbol of household power. Elite dwellings frequently contain higher quality pottery, metalwork, and imported goods compared to ordinary residences. Burial practices mirror this pattern, with elite graves occasionally containing weapons, ornaments, and imported items that signal status. In contrast, the majority of the population maintained modest domestic and funerary assemblages, reflecting both resource limitations and the hierarchical differentiation imposed by household-based leadership. This material differentiation demonstrates how authority and social stratification persisted without palatial institutions. In sum, the early Dark Age saw a fundamental transformation in the organization of power. Authority shifted from centrally administered palaces to decentralized households, where leadership was personal, resource-based, and kin-dependent. Households assumed roles formerly occupied by palace bureaucrats, including economic management, ritual oversight, and local defense. Archaeological evidence, from longhouse architecture and artifact assemblages to burial patterns and defensive equipment, confirms that social hierarchy persisted, albeit in a localized and less formalized form. These elites expressed status through material culture, shaping both settlement organization and visual markers of authority across the early Dark Age landscape. Status was now buried, not recorded. In the absence of palatial administration, archaeological evidence from sites across mainland Greece demonstrates that grave goods and funerary organization increasingly reflected emerging inequalities among households and communities. While the majority of burials were modest in scale, a minority of graves contained weapons, jewelry, and imported items, signaling the presence of an elite stratum. These practices indicate that social differentiation persisted despite the collapse of centralized authority, with households asserting status through tangible, enduring symbols rather than administrative documentation. Elite graves frequently include weapons such as bronze or early iron swords, daggers, and spear points. These assemblages are particularly evident in inland sites like Nicoria and Lefkandi, where select burials contain multiple arms alongside domestic or ritual items. The presence of weapons in graves suggests that martial ability and personal valor were increasingly central to social distinction. Household leaders and warrior elites could consolidate influence by demonstrating both their capacity to defend their kin and their control over productive resources, embedding martial values within the emerging social hierarchy. The composition and richness of grave goods reveal additional layers of inequality. Jewelry, imported pottery, and specialized tools appear predominantly in the burials of high-status individuals, while ordinary graves often contain simple utilitarian items or no goods at all. These differences provide archaeologists with a reliable metric for assessing the relative wealth and social influence of households. The spatial distribution of graves also reinforces these patterns, with prominent burials often located in central or elevated positions within cemeteries, suggesting deliberate placement to signal authority and prestige to the wider community. Cremation practices, which became more common in certain regions, offer further insight into evolving social norms. In some inland settlements, cremated remains were interred in urns with accompanying tools or ornaments, indicating a deliberate effort to memorialize select individuals. The combination of cremation and grave goods reflects both practical adaptation to limited space or resources and the desire to maintain visible markers of social distinction. Regional variation in funerary practice also highlights localized strategies for expressing household authority, demonstrating that hierarchy was maintained through culturally specific customs rather than uniform palace-imposed systems. Archaeologists interpret these patterns as part of a broader reorganization of social power. Without palace oversight, households assumed responsibility for enforcing norms, negotiating alliances, and signaling authority. Burial practices functioned as both ritual observance and public demonstration of influence. By embedding wealth, martial symbols, and imported items within graves, elite households reinforced their standing across generations, creating durable markers of status in a society where administrative records no longer existed. The appearance of imported or high-quality goods in burials also indicates continued, though limited, participation in regional exchange networks. Even in the reduced trade environment of the early Dark Age, elite households could acquire foreign items through local intermediaries or small-scale exchange, thereby reinforcing social differentiation. This integration of external material into local funerary contexts underscores the dual role of grave goods. They reflected both internal community hierarchies and connections to broader cultural and economic systems. Overall, burial evidence demonstrates that social hierarchy persisted and adapted in response to systemic collapse. The early Dark Age was not a period of uniform egalitarianism. Rather, households strategically employed material culture to assert status, consolidate authority, and reinforce martial and kinship-based values. Weapons, ornaments, and imported items provided durable markers of influence, while spatial organization of cemeteries reflected conscious social signaling. These funerary practices reveal the mechanisms by which decentralized communities maintain differentiation and continuity in the absence of centralized palace structures. These hierarchies shaped belief systems, as elite authority became intertwined with ritual practice, religious observance, and communal memory, laying the foundation for early Dark Age ideology. The gods survived the fall of palaces. Archaeological evidence indicates that religious practices persisted across early Dark Age Greece despite the collapse of centralized palatial authority. Shrines, cult sites, and sacred spaces associated with Mycenaean religion remained in use or were adapted by local communities. Excavations at Lefkandi, Nicoria, and other inland settlements reveal continuity in ritual architecture, including designated altars, hearths, and open-air sanctuaries. These structures suggest that communal worship and sacrificial activities endured, providing stability and continuity for populations navigating social and economic disruption. The persistence of Bronze Age cult practices demonstrates that religious life was rooted not solely in palace sponsorship, but in localized community structures capable of maintaining ritual observance. Evidence from votive deposits illustrates continuity in ritual material culture. Terracotta figurines, simple pottery offerings, and occasional imported items are found in early Dark Age contexts, mirroring forms common in the late Bronze Age. These offerings indicate ongoing devotion to familiar deities or cultic concepts, even as broader political structures disintegrated. Hearths and pits containing animal bones suggest continued sacrificial activity, reinforcing communal cohesion and the maintenance of ritual tradition. The consistency of these practices across multiple regions highlights both the resilience of religious customs and their adaptability to decentralized social organization. Settlement patterning also reflects the integration of religious practice into local community life. Shrines were often located near elite residences or central gathering spaces, linking ritual observance with household authority. In some cases, these sites were positioned on elevated terrain or adjacent to water sources, echoing Mycenaean topographic preferences for sacred spaces. The persistence of spatial patterns indicates that early Dark Age communities maintained continuity with inherited sacred landscapes, suggesting an enduring conceptual connection between geography and ritual practice. Burial evidence further underscores continuity in religious belief. Cremation and inhumation practices retained ritualized elements such as grave goods, symbolic placement of objects, and orientation of burials. These practices demonstrate that concepts of the afterlife, ancestral veneration, and spiritual oversight remained central to community life. Even when social hierarchy was expressed through household authority, ritual observance provided a mechanism for reinforcing communal memory and shared identity. In this way, religious practice functioned as both a stabilizing force and a vehicle for cultural continuity during periods of systemic upheaval. The material continuity of cult practices aligns with the emergence of oral tradition as a medium for transmitting memory and knowledge. Without written records, communities relied on storytelling, ritual recitation, and mythic frameworks to preserve cultural norms, genealogies, and religious observances. Sites such as Lefkandi suggest that communal gatherings may have included ritualized narratives, integrating both performance and sacred function. These oral practices facilitated the retention of Bronze Age cosmology and ritual structure, bridging the gap between past and present despite the absence of centralized administration or formal record-keeping. Regional variation in religious expression also becomes evident during this period. While core elements of Bronze Age worship persisted, localized adaptation produced distinct ritual styles and practices. Variation in offerings, cult images, and ceremonial construction reflects the integration of community-specific needs and resources into broader inherited religious frameworks. Such differentiation underscores the flexibility of early Dark Age religious life. Continuity was maintained, but innovation and adaptation allowed communities to respond to the constraints imposed by demographic contraction, regional isolation, and economic simplification. In sum, the evidence demonstrates that religious life remained a central aspect of early Dark Age society. Cult practices, shrines, and ritualized burials reflect a continuity of belief that transcended the collapse of palatial administration. Material culture, settlement patterns, and oral transmission mechanisms collectively ensured the survival of Bronze Age religious concepts, embedding them within household and community frameworks. These practices provided not only spiritual guidance but also a sense of social cohesion, memory, and identity, shaping the cultural landscape of early Dark Age Greece. Ritual memory expanded through storytelling, ensuring that cultural knowledge, sacred traditions, and ancestral identity were preserved across generations in the absence of written records. History lived through voice, not text. In the absence of written records during the early Greek Dark Age, oral traditions became the primary vehicle for preserving communal memory and transmitting social knowledge. Epic poetry, storytelling, and ritual recitations allowed communities to maintain continuity of cultural norms, heroic ideals, and collective history. Sites such as Lefkandi provide indirect evidence of performance spaces or communal halls where such oral transmission may have occurred, often integrated into domestic, religious, or ceremonial contexts. The retention of narrative structures and thematic motifs from the Mycenaean period indicates that oral memory functioned as a repository for social values and institutional knowledge, even in a decentralized society. Epic narratives served multiple social functions. They codified heroic ideals, reinforcing notions of personal valor, kinship loyalty, and household authority. Figures and events preserved in mythic frameworks conveyed lessons about leadership, resource management, and intergenerational continuity. For example, stories of warrior exploits or household defense could guide local elites in consolidating authority, demonstrating that oral poetry was both entertainment and a mechanism for social instruction. Archaeologists and comparative historians note that the survival of these motifs across centuries suggests a deliberate effort to maintain cultural memory in the absence of palatial oversight. These oral traditions also preserved geographic knowledge and territorial memory. Narratives often referenced rivers, mountains, and key settlements, embedding landscape awareness within communal storytelling. Such knowledge would have been essential in a period of regional isolation and mobility, helping groups navigate local resources, agricultural zones, and defensive locations. By maintaining an accurate, if stylized, record of physical space, oral poetry contributed to both survival and social cohesion. Communities could transmit critical information about resources, alliances, and seasonal patterns without relying on written documentation. The content of oral poetry also reflects continuity in religious and ritual life. Epic narratives frequently integrated references to divine figures, sacred sites, and ceremonial practices, reinforcing the relationship between human action and spiritual authority. These references complemented material cult evidence, ensuring that religious knowledge remained embedded within the collective memory. Oral transmission provided a flexible medium for adapting these traditions to local circumstances, while preserving the core cosmology inherited from the Bronze Age. Archaeological indicators suggest that performance of oral poetry was closely linked to household and community authority. Elite households likely served as focal points for gatherings where stories were recited or enacted, combining entertainment, ritual observance, and political affirmation. The inclusion of heroic exploits or lineage narratives reinforced the authority of household leaders, linking social hierarchy with collective memory. In this way, oral poetry functioned as a vehicle for both cultural transmission and social stratification, sustaining values and expectations even without formal administrative structures. Regional variation in oral tradition emerged alongside the fragmentation of settlement patterns. Communities isolated by geographic features or limited communication networks developed localized versions of shared narratives, reflecting both continuity and adaptation. Differences in motif, emphasis, or associated ritual practice demonstrate that oral memory was both a unifying and differentiating force, preserving cultural cohesion while allowing for regional identity formation. Archaeologists and literary scholars interpret these variations as evidence of dynamic adaptation in response to changing social and environmental conditions. The impact of oral poetry extended to economic behavior and social organization. Narratives emphasizing household loyalty, warrior prowess, and resource management encouraged behaviors that maintained social stability and facilitated cooperative labor. Knowledge embedded in stories guided subsistence strategies, seasonal work, and conflict resolution, illustrating that cultural memory was directly linked to practical survival. In the absence of palatial oversight, Oral tradition ensured that critical norms and technical knowledge could be transmitted across generations, sustaining the coherence of early Dark Age communities. In sum, oral poetry and storytelling constituted a central mechanism for preserving social values, heroic ideals, and cultural knowledge during the Greek Dark Ages. These traditions ensured continuity of collective memory, maintained links between households, elites, and communities, and reinforced both religious and secular norms. By embedding practical, moral, and cosmological guidance in memorable narrative forms, oral culture allowed early Dark Age Greeks to navigate a fragmented and decentralized society, ensuring that the legacy of the Bronze Age persisted even without written records. These beliefs influenced economic behavior, shaping patterns of subsistence, resource allocation, and community cooperation across the emerging early Dark Age landscape. Survival depended on land, not trade. In the early Dark Age, the collapse of palace economies and long-distance trade forced Greek communities to reorganize their economic activities around subsistence agriculture and localized exchange networks. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Lefkandi, Nicoria, and Dimini demonstrates that households and small settlements prioritized cereal cultivation, olive production, and livestock management as the primary means of survival. Fields were intensively cultivated, often employing terracing and soil management techniques to maximize yield on limited land. Crops such as barley, wheat, legumes, and olives formed the core of dietary staples, while sheep, goats, and cattle provided meat, milk, and secondary products essential for household stability. Material remains indicate that households often maintained small-scale storage facilities for both grain and olive oil, suggesting careful management of resources to buffer against seasonal variability or poor harvests. Storage pits, ceramic containers, and simple granaries are common in early Dark Age settlements, reflecting both pragmatic adaptation and the need for self-sufficiency. These storage strategies highlight the shift from reliance on palace-managed redistribution to direct household control over production, with survival tied to effective land use rather than centralized provisioning. Local exchange networks complemented subsistence agriculture. While interregional trade had collapsed, archaeological finds indicate that communities continued to exchange essential goods such as salt, metal tools, pottery, and occasionally luxury items. Coastal settlements, particularly in the Cyclades and Euboea, served as minor hubs for the movement of basic commodities, facilitating small-scale commerce between otherwise isolated inland communities. This localized trade allowed households to acquire tools, raw materials, and select prestige items while maintaining independence from long-distance supply chains. Evidence from pottery distribution demonstrates the scale and scope of local exchange. Geometric wares produced in one region frequently appear in neighboring settlements, suggesting that artisans supplied nearby communities rather than wide-ranging markets. Bronze tools, ornament fragments, and occasional imported items, though limited, circulated through these regional networks. Such exchanges were sufficient to sustain basic craft specialization and reinforce social hierarchies, as elite households could acquire distinctive items that signaled authority and economic capacity within a localized framework. Agricultural and exchange practices were closely integrated with household and kin-based authority. Households controlling arable land, water access, or strategic transport routes could consolidate influence by coordinating labor and overseeing production. This economic control reinforced social hierarchy, linking subsistence management to political authority in a manner analogous to the earlier palace-centered systems, though on a smaller, decentralized scale. Archaeological evidence, including larger longhouse complexes with associated storage and workshop areas, confirms that productive households were focal points for both resource management and social coordination. The stability provided by subsistence agriculture enabled communities to experiment with emerging technologies. Ironworking, which gradually replaced bronze as the primary material for tools and weapons, was adopted incrementally and unevenly across early Dark Age Greece. Iron offered a more abundant and locally sourced alternative to the limited supply of bronze, enabling households to maintain agricultural implements, weaponry, and craft tools without reliance on distant trade networks. The introduction of iron tools enhanced productivity, allowing for more efficient land clearing, tilling, and maintenance of terraces, thereby reinforcing the centrality of land-based subsistence. Archaeobotanical and faunal evidence illustrates adaptive strategies to environmental constraints. Crop diversity, rotational planting, and mixed animal husbandry minimized risk and ensured a stable supply of essential resources. Communities were capable of responding to regional variability in soil fertility, rainfall, and microclimate conditions. Local exchange complemented these practices by allowing households to balance surpluses and deficits, facilitating both food security and social cohesion in the absence of palace-directed redistribution. In sum, subsistence agriculture and localized exchange formed the economic foundation of early Dark Age Greece. Households and small communities relied primarily on land for survival, managing crops, livestock, and storage with care and sophistication. Local networks enabled limited trade, supporting both material needs and social differentiation, while emerging iron technologies gradually enhanced production and craft capability. Together, these factors stabilized communities during a period of demographic contraction, settlement fragmentation, and the absence of central authority, ensuring that the economic underpinnings of Greek society endured and adapted to new conditions. Iron transformed production, enabling both craft specialization and the gradual reorganization of household economies across the early Dark Age landscape. Iron ended dependence on long-distance trade. The early Greek Dark Age witnessed the gradual introduction of iron metallurgy, which fundamentally altered both agriculture and warfare. Unlike bronze, which required imported tin and copper, iron could be sourced locally from or deposits scattered across the Aegean and mainland Greece. Archaeological evidence indicates that small-scale smelting operations appeared as early as the late 11th century BCE, with more widespread use emerging during the 10th century BCE. Sites such as Lefkandi, Nicoria, and Tiryns provide evidence of furnaces, slag deposits, and iron tools, demonstrating that communities had begun to integrate this technology into daily life. The adoption of iron allowed households to maintain productive capacity independently of the long-distance trade networks that had collapsed with the palaces. Iron tools gradually replaced bronze in both agricultural and domestic contexts. Plows, sickles, hoes, and axes were increasingly manufactured in iron, enabling more efficient clearing, tilling, and maintenance of fields. The durability and availability of iron provided communities with a sustainable source of implements that supported subsistence farming, terracing, and forestry. Archaeobotanical analysis indicates that these improvements may have allowed for incremental increases in yield, stabilizing food supply and supporting small-scale population growth in otherwise fragmented settlements. The shift to iron was not uniform. Some regions retained bronze tools alongside early iron examples, reflecting gradual adoption and localized resource availability. Iron also reshaped the production and organization of weapons. Swords, daggers, spearheads, and defensive implements became more widely accessible, particularly in inland settlements where local or deposits were abundant. These tools were often found in graves or domestic contexts, suggesting that households, rather than centralized authorities, controlled production and distribution. The presence of iron weaponry reinforced the rising importance of martial prestige in social hierarchy, allowing elite households to consolidate authority and secure territory. Unlike bronze, whose acquisition depended on long-distance trade, iron technology democratized access to essential weaponry, enabling both defense and limited offensive capability in small-scale conflicts. The technological transition had implications for craft specialization and skill transmission. Ironworking required knowledge of smelting, forging, and shaping, fostering the emergence of specialized artisans. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that workshops associated with domestic compounds were common, producing tools for both household use and local exchange. These artisans often maintained a combination of bronze and ironworking skills, suggesting a period of technological overlap. The development of ironworking as a household or community-centered craft indicates that innovation was embedded in local social structures rather than imposed from above, reinforcing the decentralized nature of early Dark Age society. Iron metallurgy also influenced regional interaction. Small-scale trade of iron tools and weapons persisted, enabling communities with surplus production or unique expertise to supply neighboring settlements. These networks were limited compared to late Bronze Age exchanges but facilitated the spread of technological knowledge and reinforced local economies. Archaeological finds of iron objects in contexts distant from or sources suggest that mobility, migration, and intercommunity exchange played a role in disseminating these innovations, providing continuity in regional connectivity despite political fragmentation. Environmental and material factors shaped the adoption of iron. Access to or fuel for smelting and water for quenching influenced both the location and scale of production. Sites near hillsides with exposed iron or river valleys conducive to smelting operations were more likely to develop early iron industries. Archaeologists have documented slag heaps, furnaces, and hammering implements at several inland settlements, indicating organized production efforts and an understanding of metallurgical processes. This combination of resource availability and technical knowledge allowed communities to adapt technology to local conditions, strengthening household economies and enhancing resilience. The adoption of iron was not only practical but also symbolic. Weaponry and tools in iron were often included in elite graves, signaling both material innovation and social status. The integration of iron into funerary practice demonstrates its significance in household authority and community prestige. Similarly, the inclusion of iron implements in domestic and ritual contexts reflects a broader cultural acceptance of the material as integral to daily life, social organization, and identity. In sum, iron metallurgy transformed early Dark Age Greece by providing a locally accessible alternative to bronze, enabling communities to sustain agriculture, craft production, and household defense independently of distant trade networks. The introduction of iron reshaped both the economy and social hierarchy, fostering specialized artisan production, stabilizing subsistence strategies, and reinforcing elite authority. As iron tools and weapons became more common, communities gradually regained technological sophistication, laying the foundation for the gradual return of craft specialization, interregional exchange, and economic diversification in the subsequent Archaic period. Craft specialization slowly returned, as communities leveraged iron technology to rebuild production, exchange, and material complexity across the early Dark Age landscape. War defined leadership. In the early Dark Age, social prestige and household authority were increasingly intertwined with martial capacity. Archaeological evidence indicates that the display of weapons in both domestic and funerary contexts became a primary indicator of status. Graves from sites such as Nicoria, Lefkandi, and central Peloponnesian settlements often contain swords, daggers, spears, and defensive implements, reflecting the centrality of warrior identity in establishing and maintaining social hierarchy. Unlike the palace-controlled armies of the Late Bronze Age, early Dark Age military authority was personal, rooted in household capability, kinship networks, and the ability to mobilize small groups of retainers or neighbors. Weapon burials functioned as both practical and symbolic markers of status. The presence of bronze or early iron swords in graves demonstrates not only access to valuable materials but also mastery of martial skills. Burials with multiple weapons or finely crafted implements are typically associated with elite households, suggesting that military prowess reinforced broader authority in society. Archaeologists note that weapons are often deposited alongside other prestige items, including imported pottery or jewelry, linking martial prestige with economic and social influence. This combination illustrates the multifaceted role of warrior identity in consolidating household power. Iconography also reflects the centrality of martial values. Early Dark Age pottery, terracotta figurines, and decorative motifs frequently depict armed figures, combat scenes, or symbolic weapon imagery. These representations are particularly concentrated in regions with defensible settlements or strategic trade routes, suggesting that visual reinforcement of martial capability was socially significant. Iconographic evidence complements the material record, confirming that combat skills, household defense, and reputation were key components of elite identity during a period of political decentralization. The social function of warrior culture extended beyond individual households. In fragmented settlements, the ability to protect a community or assert dominance over territory was essential for survival. Elite households that controlled arms and trained fighters could secure arable land, maintain resource access, and negotiate alliances. Archaeological evidence from fortified hilltop settlements indicates that communities recognized and reinforced this authority through both construction and ritual. Defensive walls, palisades, and strategically located dwellings highlight the material manifestation of martial prestige, linking architecture with social hierarchy and collective security. Weapons also played a role in inter-household and regional dynamics. Evidence of trade or localized exchange of weaponry suggests that households without direct access to raw materials relied on networks to acquire arms. Iron implements, when available, were prized not only for practical functionality, but also for their symbolic association with technological innovation and martial competence. The spread of iron weaponry further democratized access to combat capability, allowing emerging elites to assert influence and defend their communities even in the absence of centralized authority. Funerary evidence demonstrates the ritualization of warrior identity. Graves containing swords, spears, or defensive equipment were often accompanied by specific spatial organization or symbolic markers, such as elevated burial mounds or orientation patterns. These practices reinforced social recognition of martial capacity, linking death, memory, and household prestige. The deliberate display of weapons in burial context signals that early Dark Age societies embedded martial values into their cultural framework, codifying status and authority through material and ceremonial means. Regional variation highlights how warrior culture intersected with local identity. Differences in burial assemblages, iconographic motifs, and settlement defensibility suggest that communities adapted martial practices to environmental, economic, and social circumstances. Coastal settlements, inland valleys, and upland hill forts each demonstrate unique patterns of weapon deposition, training emphasis, and iconographic representation. These variations indicate that while the ideal of the warrior elite was widespread, its expression was highly localized, reflecting both continuity with Mycenaean precedents and adaptation to early Dark Age circumstances. In sum, the early Dark Age witnessed the centralization of social prestige around martial capability and household defense. Weapons, iconography, and burial practices reveal that warfare was not only a practical necessity but a primary mechanism for asserting authority, maintaining social hierarchy, and consolidating regional influence. Household-based elites leveraged martial competence to protect resources, assert dominance, and reinforce communal recognition, establishing a culture in which personal and familial power was inseparable from military capacity. Conflict reinforced identity, linking households, communities, and emerging regional groups through shared experience, competition, and the material culture of war. Land became worth defending again. The early Dark Age in Greece saw the emergence of defensive architecture as a central feature of settlement organization, reflecting heightened awareness of territorial control and security. Archaeological evidence indicates that communities strategically selected locations with natural advantages, such as hilltops, cliffs, and river terraces, and augmented them with constructed fortifications. Sites such as Tiryns, Nicoria, and later phase settlements across the Peloponnese reveal ramparts, stone walls, and terraced embankments, demonstrating both engineering skill and an understanding of strategic placement. The proliferation of these fortifications underscores the increasing importance of defending productive land, community resources, and households in a fragmented socio-political landscape. Fortifications were not uniform across regions, reflecting variations in settlement density, environmental constraints, and perceived threat levels. Hilltop settlements in central and southern Greece often incorporated thick stone walls and gate systems, indicating preparation for sustained defense. Smaller inland villages, by contrast, relied on natural topography or palisades to protect limited perimeters. Archaeological stratigraphy suggests that many of these defensive works were constructed gradually, with repairs and modifications over decades, signaling long-term investment in territorial security rather than immediate reaction to isolated threats. Defensive architecture was closely linked to household authority and elite status. Households that controlled fortified settlements maintained both economic and military dominance within their communities. Large, Longhouse-style dwellings were often located adjacent to walls or elevated platforms, providing oversight of approaches and reinforcing the association between domestic authority and territorial control. Grave evidence near fortified settlements frequently contains weapons or prestige items, further connecting martial capacity with household leadership. Fortifications thus functioned as both practical instruments of defense and symbolic statements of social hierarchy. The placement and design of fortifications also reveal patterns of intercommunity interaction. Settlements within proximity of one another often exhibit complementary defensive arrangements, suggesting coordination or tacit acknowledgement of boundaries. Archaeological surveys indicate that clusters of fortified sites may have functioned as territorial networks, with each settlement controlling a portion of arable land, water sources, and trade routes. Such networks reflect a growing awareness of territorial limits, resource management, and the strategic value of land in early Dark Age Greece. Defensive features were integrated with domestic, economic, and ritual infrastructure. Fortified sites frequently include storage pits, workshops, and communal spaces within their walls, indicating that defense was combined with ongoing household production and social activity. In some cases, small shrines or ritual deposits are located within or near defensive works, suggesting that protection was not solely physical but also ritualized. These combined functions highlight the multidimensional role of fortifications in early Dark Age society, linking survival, authority, and cultural practice. The construction and maintenance of fortifications required specialized labor and organizational capacity, indicating a degree of community cooperation. Households with surplus resources or authority could mobilize labor to build walls, terraces, or gates, consolidating power through both material and social control. The labor-intensive nature of these projects also reinforced social cohesion, as coordinated work strengthened alliances between households and embedded defense within the fabric of community life. Archaeological evidence of phased construction and repairs over time suggests that such efforts were sustained by institutionalized household networks rather than centralized administration. Territorial fortification was closely related to the redistribution of resources. Control over defensible sites allowed elite households to regulate access to fields, water, and trade routes, thereby stabilizing local economies. Archaeological finds of weapon caches and storage within fortified enclosures indicate that defensive capability was intertwined with household economic authority. These settlements were simultaneously military strongholds, production centers, and social hubs, reflecting the integrated nature of early Dark Age community organization. In summary, fortifications reflect the resurgence of territorial consciousness in early Dark Age Greece. Strategic site selection, ramparts, walls, and defensive planning demonstrate both practical concern for security and the symbolic assertion of household and community authority. Fortified settlements functioned as hubs of production, defense, and social hierarchy, reinforcing the connection between martial capacity, resource control, and regional stability. By investing in defensive infrastructure, early Greek communities codified territorial boundaries, protected subsistence resources, and laid the groundwork for stable regional consolidation in subsequent centuries. Stable regions expanded, enabling larger communities and more complex social, economic, and political organization to emerge during the late Dark Age. Greece began to repopulate. By the early 9th century BCE, archaeological surveys indicate a notable increase in settlement density across mainland Greece, signaling the initial phase of demographic recovery following the disruptions of the Dark Age. Previously abandoned coastal and inland sites were reoccupied, and new settlements emerged, often in defensible locations or near productive land. The return to previously depopulated areas suggests both natural population growth and increased mobility, as households sought to reclaim arable fields, grazing territories, and access to water resources. Settlement expansion reflects not only survival but also the stabilization of social and economic structures that had been severely disrupted during the collapse of the palaces. Excavations across regions such as Boeotia, Laconia, and Euboea document the construction of larger, more organized domestic compounds, often with multiple interconnected structures. These complexes indicate a growing household size and the incorporation of extended kin networks, consistent with both population growth and increasing social complexity. Storage facilities, terracing, and workshop areas were more common than in earlier Dark Age settlements, suggesting that households were again able to accumulate surpluses, manage resources, and coordinate production for both subsistence and local exchange. Ceramic evidence demonstrates an expansion of both quantity and quality of material culture, reflecting increased population and the re-establishment of craft specialization. Pottery production became more standardized within regions, with identifiable local styles emerging alongside continued adaptation of earlier geometric motifs. This combination of continuity and innovation indicates that communities were not merely expanding physically, but also re-establishing cultural norms and local identity. Artifact density in these settlements confirms that recovery was accompanied by renewed economic activity, supporting the growth of household and community networks. Population growth was accompanied by the formation of larger, aggregated settlements that foreshadowed the protopolis structures of the 8th century BCE. Hilltop settlements, previously fortified primarily for survival, became centers of social organization and production, integrating multiple households under shared management of land, water, and defensive infrastructure. Archaeological indicators, including expanded ramparts and central communal spaces, suggest coordination among households, pointing toward emergent forms of local governance. These developments mark a transition from isolated kin-based households to the beginnings of complex communities capable of organizing resources, labor, and defense at a regional scale. Agricultural intensification supported this demographic recovery. Evidence of expanded field systems, irrigation, and terracing indicates that early Greek communities could sustain larger populations through more efficient land management. Livestock herding remained essential, complementing crop production and providing stability against environmental fluctuations. The interplay between settlement expansion, agricultural productivity, and social organization underscores the interdependence of demographic growth and economic stability. Communities were able to repopulate areas previously considered marginal or insecure, reflecting both resilience and strategic adaptation to local conditions. The growth of settlements also fostered increased interaction among previously isolated regions. Early Dark Age communities had experienced significant fragmentation, with limited interregional contact. The reoccupation and expansion of sites allowed for gradual restoration of exchange networks, facilitating the movement of goods, ideas, and technologies. Pottery distribution, metal objects, and imported items indicate that local trade and social connectivity were re-emerging, though at a smaller scale than the late Bronze Age palaces. This renewed interaction contributed to cultural standardization and reinforced emerging hierarchies within and between settlements. Overall, the increase in population and settlement size during this period represents the first stage in the formation of more complex, organized communities in Greece. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that recovery was multifaceted, encompassing household expansion, agricultural intensification, craft production, and regional interaction. The re-establishment of demographic stability provided the foundation for emergent governance structures, protopolis organization, and the cultural revival that would characterize the late 9th and early 8th centuries BCE. Larger communities required governance, as emerging population centers necessitated coordination of resources, defense, and social order in the protopolis landscape. The darkness lifted gradually. By the early 8th century BCE, archaeological and historical evidence indicates that Greece was emerging from the systemic disruptions of the Dark Age into a period of political and economic stabilization that would characterize the Archaic period. Settlement density increased, particularly in defensible inland sites and strategically located coastal areas, reflecting both demographic recovery and renewed territorial organization. Large-scale aggregation of households began to form protopolis structures, consolidating resources, labor, and governance within coherent communities. These settlements demonstrate a growing capacity for economic coordination and centralized decision-making, marking the end of the most severe phase of fragmentation. The reintroduction of material wealth is evident across domestic and ritual contexts. Pottery production became more standardized, with regional styles coalescing and a wider circulation of geometric wares indicating a gradual expansion of local exchange networks. Metalwork, particularly iron tools and weapons, became more widespread, supporting agricultural productivity and household defense. These developments suggest a stabilized economic base that allowed communities to engage in sustained craft specialization and long-term planning, rather than merely subsisting on minimal resources. Household elites played a central role in organizing labor, production, and trade, reinforcing emerging social hierarchies and establishing the foundations for institutional governance. Fortifications and strategic site selection continued to influence settlement organization, but the purpose of defensive works evolved. Walls and ramparts served not only as protective measures but also as statements of territorial control and political cohesion. Settlements increasingly included communal spaces, storage facilities, and workshops within fortified precincts, reflecting integrated economic, military, and social planning. Archaeological evidence indicates that these communities were capable of sustaining larger populations and maintaining resource management systems that transcended individual households, signaling a shift toward coordinated governance and proto-state structures. Ritual continuity and cultural memory also contributed to stabilization. Bronze Age cult practices, adapted to decentralized household and community contexts, persisted in shrines, domestic spaces, and burial sites. Oral traditions and epic storytelling remained central to the transmission of social norms, heroic ideals, and ancestral knowledge. By integrating religious observance with household authority and communal gatherings, these practices provided both ideological continuity and social cohesion. They reinforced shared values and collective identity, supporting cooperative behavior essential for governance, defense, and economic coordination in larger settlements. Population growth and settlement expansion were accompanied by the gradual reestablishment of regional connectivity. Early Dark Age isolation had produced localized cultural practices, but the Archaic transition saw renewed exchange of goods, ideas, and technological knowledge across wider areas. Pottery styles, iron tools, and ritual artifacts circulated more broadly, linking communities while preserving regional distinction. This combination of localized identity and interregional interaction facilitated both economic diversification and social integration, establishing the networks necessary for the development of city-states and political institutions that characterized the Archaic period. Evidence from burial practices indicates that social hierarchies solidified in this transitional phase. Elite households continued to display martial and economic power through weapon deposits, imported items, and conspicuous grave constructions. The integration of ritual, status display, and household authority reinforced communal recognition of leadership, providing continuity from earlier Dark Age social structures while supporting the emergence of more complex political institutions. These practices suggest that the lessons of survival, territorial awareness, and household management shaped the norms and expectations of Archaic governance. In sum, the transition to the Archaic period was gradual, marked by the stabilization of population, economy, and political structures. Recovery from the fragmentation of the Dark Age allowed Greece to consolidate larger communities, restore craft specialization, and reintegrate exchange networks. Material, architectural, and ritual evidence illustrates the emergence of proto-polis centers capable of organizing resources, defense, and social coordination. Continuity in cult practices, oral traditions, and social hierarchy ensured that the cultural and institutional memory of the Dark Age informed the development of new political, economic, and religious systems. By 800 BCE, Greece had begun to emerge from centuries of disruption, carrying forward the lessons of survival, adaptation, and localized authority into the foundations of Archaic society. New institutions carried old lessons, embedding the memory of collapse, adaptation, and household authority into the structures that would define Greek city-states in the centuries to come. If you found this journey through the Greek Dark Ages informative, subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to stay updated on our daily Nightfall history videos. Share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Greece's recovery surprised you most? Your engagement helps us explore the past with even greater depth and clarity.